September 5, 1914. A luxury car drove into a mansion in the town of Mourmelon, France. This mansion was the temporary headquarters of the British Expeditionary Force. At this moment, the 62-year-old British Army Commander-in-Chief was busy planning the retreat route for the troops. What had happened in the past month was nothing short of a nightmare. The French 17 Plan had suffered a devastating failure, losing 300,000 troops in just a few weeks. Meanwhile, the 5 German army groups on the right flank, totaling 1.14 million men, had breached the Belgian defenses and were advancing into northern France. In contrast, the British had only 7 divisions, totaling 160,000 men. Since landing, their only option had been retreat, and continuous retreat. Now, the vanguard of the German army had reached the outskirts of Paris. French had repeatedly sought permission from London to withdraw the British forces back to their homeland. In his view, since the French themselves were unable to defend their homeland, there was no need for the British to bleed and sacrifice for it. At this moment, there was a knock on the door, and the visitor was none other than the French Army Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff Joseph Joffre. Joffre was not good at diplomatic niceties, so he got straight to the point as soon as he entered the room. The French were about to launch a counteroffensive, and they needed the assistance of the British. He then unfolded a map and detailed the French plan. His presentation was vivid and full of passion. According to French's secretary's recollection, it was as if we could see every unit moving according to his intentions on the vast battlefield, like a precise machine, until they reached their designated positions. Trains lined up in long columns, soldiers shuttled back and forth, ammunition piled up like mountains. Guns remained silent but ready to fire, and in the end, it pointed out the weak spots of the Germans for us. The advancing army resembled a massive gray flood rushing towards the cliff until it rolled over the cliff. At the end of this conversation, Joffre pointed to a red dot on the map and said with great certainty, "We will end the enemy's advance here, and this red dot is the Marne River." Before the outbreak of World War I, military strategists of various countries had vied to predict that the next war would be decided quickly, because no country could afford a long war. From an economic perspective, they were right. Take Germany, which had the strongest army before the war, for example. It mobilized 75 cities and a total of 2 million troops before the war. Such a massive army could spend the government's entire budget in 3 months and deplete the country's reserves in 6 months. As for the economic losses caused, they were incalculable. So, as soon as the war broke out, Germany had only one option: blitzkrieg. In 1891, Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, the former chief of the German General Staff, devised an ambitious plan. Its strategic goal was to concentrate superior forces, pass through Belgium, and sweep through France within 6 weeks. To understand the Schlieffen plan, we must first understand the geographical conditions between France and Germany. Since the humiliating cession of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871, France had lost the natural barrier of the Vosges Mountains and had to spend a huge sum to build a concrete defense line. This line included 4 strong fortresses: Belfort, Epinal, Toul, and Verdun. This defense line, like the later Maginot Line, was not meant to stop the German army but to force it to bypass. North of Verdun was Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, 3 lowland countries. Their existence was crucial to Britain's strategic security, so France was almost defenseless on this side, aiming to lure Germany into attacking and then dragging Britain into the fray. Schlieffen was well aware of the cost of passing through the lowland countries, but in his view, as long as France could be quickly defeated, the risk of British intervention was negligible after all. Warships don't have wheels. January 1906. The incumbent Schlieffen handed over this plan to his successor, Moltke. His last words were, "If necessary, strengthen the right wing." 8 years later, the inevitable war broke out, and Moltke found that this perfect plan was flawed from the beginning. The first problem was what to do if Belgium refused to allow passage. On August 2nd, 1914, an ultimatum from Berlin was placed on the desk of the Belgian government. It stated that in view of the French army's imminent crossing of the Belgian border to attack Germany, the German army had to mobilize in self-defense. If this action were considered aggression by the Belgian government, Germany would deeply regret it and would consider Belgium an enemy. Moltke naturally assumed that this ultimatum alone would be enough to make Belgium surrender. After all, the military strength of the two countries was so disparate. But several hours later, a reply was sent to Berlin. It stated that the Belgian government refused to accept every single term proposed by Berlin, all of which were serious insults to Belgian national dignity and would force Belgium to betray its responsibilities to Europe. But no matter how Belgium responded, the German army was already poised to strike and had to do so. 3 days later, the Battle of Liège officially began. In fact, the Schlieffen Plan was not a secret in European countries before the outbreak of the war. So, before the war broke out, Belgium had built a series of fortresses on the German border. The most famous of these was the Liège fortress. This fortress bordered the Netherlands to the north and the Ardennes to the south, and it was the only way for the German army to attack France. The fortress consisted of 12 circular forts made of reinforced concrete, equipped with a total of 400 artillery pieces. On August 5th, the leading German troops launched the first round of attacks on the Liège fortress, confronting the concrete fortress with human flesh and blood. Anyone familiar with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 knew what the consequences would be. The German army attacked for a day and a night, with casualties reaching 10,000. The next afternoon, Deputy Chief of Staff Rudolph of the 2nd Army Group arrived at the front line. This future influential figure in the German army clearly would not make the same mistake here, as he had a trump card in his hands. 420 mm Big Berthas. These giant siege guns were manufactured by Krupp, 7 meters long, weighing 42 tons, with a range of up to 12.5 kilometers, firing a 1-ton armor-piercing shell with a built-in time delay fuse that would explode after penetrating the fortress defenses. On August 12th, all the giant guns were ready. With a command from Rudolph, 800 gunners ignited electronic igniters 300 meters away. There was a deafening roar, and the powerful shells whistled through the sky. One of them hit the top cover of the Freyer fort precisely. The shell penetrated the concrete layer, detonated the ammunition depot, shattered the defensive works on the spot, and none of the defenders survived. In the next 4 days, under the command of the airship, the German artillery continuously adjusted its aim, and 11 of the 12 batteries of the Liège fortress were leveled. Only the Lonson fortress, defended by General Lehmann of the Belgian army, remained resistant. After failed attempts to surrender, Rudolph ordered a bombardment. With several loud explosions, the last fortress of the Belgians also turned into a pile of rubble, and General Lehmann was injured by the explosion and became a prisoner. Thus, the Battle of Liège officially came to an end. Although the Belgian army ultimately failed to stop the German advance, they delayed the Germans for 11 days with astonishing courage. These 11 days of delay became the first domino to fall in the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. In 1911, 3 years before the outbreak of World War I, 59-year-old Joseph Joffre became the new chief of staff of the French army. At that time, the French military thinking was severely outdated. Among them, the spiritualist school was the most absurd. This school regarded Napoleon's theories as truth, believing that the outcome of war depended entirely on spirit, and weapons without courage were ineffective. But courage without weapons could be unstoppable. Guided by this obsolete thinking, the French army retained many military traditions of the 19th century, including brightly colored red and blue uniforms and noisy military bands, as well as cavalry formations, fighting with cold weapons and densely packed charging tactics. These traditions led to the French army paying a heavy price after the outbreak of the war. But the destruction they could cause was far less than what the French army had planned before the war with the Plan 17. According to this plan, the main force of the French army would not passively defend around Verdun and Toul, but would instead launch an offensive towards Alsace-Lorraine. Crossing the Vosges Mountains, it would reach the Rhine, threatening the heart of Germany's industrial zone and forcing the German army to redeploy. This idea seemed very good, but when the war actually broke out, Joffre found himself in an embarrassing situation. On August 11, 1914, when the German army was bogged down in the Liège fortress, the French army mobilized 5 army groups totaling 1.1 million troops to counterattack Germany, with 1/3 of the troops being deployed on the front line of Alsace-Lorraine. August 20th, the Battle of Morhange began. In this battle, 40,000 French soldiers, accompanied by military music and slogans, charged into an open area. However, near Morhange, there was a German observation post built in advance on the mountain. They accurately marked the position of the French formation and transmitted the information via radio to the artillery positions in the rear. Subsequently, 10 150 mm howitzers and 40 77 mm field guns poured a rain of shells onto the French troops. The French were instantly thrown into disarray, routed, while the Germans suffered almost no losses. They annihilated 5,000 French troops and captured 20,000 prisoners. 2 days after the Battle of Morhange, 2 French army groups crossed the Ardennes forest and attacked the Belgian town of Vervins, held by the Germans. On that day, thick fog enveloped the battlefield, allowing the French to reach the foot of the German positions unnoticed. However, when they launched the attack, the thick fog suddenly dissipated, exposing them to a fierce counterattack from the Germans. According to the French Army's combat manual at the time, each soldier was required to advance 55 yards within 20 seconds before the enemy could reload. However, the officer who wrote this manual completely ignored another Grim Reaper on the battlefield: the machine gun. Before the war broke out, the German army was equipped with 12,000 Maxim heavy machine guns, which meant that on a local battlefield, there was a machine gun firing point every 100 meters. Therefore, the Battle of Vervins inevitably became a new slaughterhouse for the French army. French soldiers launched wave after wave of charges towards the mountaintop, only to be mowed down in batches by the dense firepower of the Maxims. German machine gunners didn't even need to aim deliberately because the bright uniforms and dense formations of the French troops were like sitting ducks. Just on August 22nd alone, the French single-day casualties reached a staggering 27,000, setting a new record in history. By the end of August, the French army had collapsed on all fronts, with 75,000 French soldiers killed and over 200,000 injured or captured. What's worse, on August 20th, the Germans occupied Brussels, and on August 24th, the vanguard of the German army entered northern France. Just as envisaged in the Schlieffen Plan, the German right wing became a death trap for the severely damaged French army, and everything unfolded as it did in 1870. However, France was very lucky in 1914 because at that time, the supreme commander of the German army was no longer the old Moltke, but his indecisive and submissive nephew. In 1906, when Schlieffen handed over the reins, he made a very accurate evaluation of his successor. A great commander is not appointed, but born. 8 years later, Schlieffen's words were proven true. It turned out that Moltke was completely incapable of commanding such a campaign of annihilation. Firstly, his character was very weak, and he lacked the prestige to command. Moreover, there were some figures in the German army that he could not afford to offend, such as the Duke of Bavaria, Duke of Württemberg, and the Crown Prince of William II. These royal relatives obviously did not regard Moltke highly, so they all acted independently on the battlefield. In the decisive Battle of the Marne that followed, the general staff could neither receive nor send orders, and they didn't even know the positions of the frontline units. Due to the lack of control over the army, Moltke dared not take the slightest risk. He first changed the ratio of forces between the left and right wings from 7 to 1, 3, completely forgetting Schlieffen's instruction to strengthen the right wing. Midway through the war, he diverted 2 armies to support the Eastern Front, only for these 2 armies to make a wasted trip. The original Schlieffen plan was like a high-stakes gamble, but after Moltke's changes, it became an ordinary plan, naturally failing to achieve its intended goals. But the question is, even if Schlieffen himself personally managed it, would this plan really be feasible? I think the answer is likely to be negative. The reason lies in the supply line. The biggest difference between World War I and previous wars is that it was a war of artillery. Without artillery support, infantry could not make any effective attacks. But people can march rapidly. Artillery cannot. So every time the German army captured a place, it had to drag heavy artillery to the next station, turning the march route into a very fixed point-to-point. And the marching speed depended entirely on the smoothness of the railway line. As a result, the French army, fighting on its home turf, had a great advantage. They could rapidly transfer to the rear using the developed railway network, so they never suffered a complete collapse. Meanwhile, the German army, due to the excessively long front lines, found resupply extremely difficult, and they also had to endure the harassment of the Belgian guerrillas. In order to deter the Belgians, the German army committed a massacre in Louvain, but such atrocities only strengthened the determination of the guerrillas to resist. Tearing up railway tracks and blowing up trains temporarily paralyzed Belgium's railway system. In the end, the German army had to resort to the most traditional method of supply, namely manpower and animal power. On September 2nd, 1914, the German First Army advanced to within 15 miles of Paris, and German soldiers could even see the Eiffel Tower just by raising their heads. However, this force was in a very bad situation. They lacked ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements, unable to cause any harm. In Paris, a general keenly realized that France could now counterattack. This general was Joseph Gallieni. In early August 1914, Gallieni was urgently recalled to serve as the commander of the Paris military district. This 65-year-old veteran had officially retired 4 months ago, but in this time of crisis, he had to come out of retirement again to turn the tide. After taking office, Gallieni closely monitored the northern front. Be September 3rd. The situation changed. In order to pursue the French Fifth Army, the German First Army began to turn to the right, exposing its flank completely. Gallieni seized the opportunity and called Joffre, stating that the time for a counterattack had come and requested him to issue the order for a general offensive. Indeed, Joffre had been waiting for this day for a long time. But before launching the formal counterattack, he needed to secure the support of the Allied forces, namely the British Expeditionary Force. Unlike other European countries, Britain had not established a system of total mobilization. Therefore, after the outbreak of the war, they only sent out a force of just 160,000 troops. This British force, after landing, first suffered heavy losses from the Germans at Mons and Le Cateau, then retreated without looking back. However, unexpectedly, they became the last hope of the Allied forces because their organization remained the most intact. And thus, the scene at the beginning of our story unfolded. On September 5th, Joffre personally visited the British Commander-in-Chief French and presented him with the complete plan for the upcoming operations. The French forces would firmly hold the line along the Marne River, creating a 20-mile gap between the 1st and 2nd German armies. As long as the British forces could timely insert themselves into this gap, they could completely reverse the situation on the Western Front. After explaining the plan, Joffre firmly shook French's hand and said, "Marshal, France entrusts you with this task." French also responded excitedly, "Rest assured, we will do everything we can." At 10 o'clock that evening, Joffre, in the name of the High Command, sent a telegram. "Soldiers of France, we are about to engage in a decisive battle. A battle that will determine the fate of our country. I declare that the stage of retreat has ended, and now we must go all out to drive the enemy out of our homeland. Every unit capable of fighting must launch continuous attacks without pause. Those unable to fight must hold their positions at all costs. Better to die in battle than to retreat a single step." The morale of the French troops, upon receiving this telegram, soared. During the month-long retreat, they had been like a spring compressed to the limit, accumulating tremendous potential energy. Now they only needed a trigger to rebound. In the early hours of September 6th, 980,000 French troops launched a full-scale counterattack against the 750,000 German troops on the northern front. In this battle, the French fully absorbed the lessons of the early experiences and divided into small units to launch assaults on the German positions. Due to the lack of heavy artillery firepower, the Germans could only rely on bullets and bayonets to resist the French. The two sides fought fiercely along the 200-kilometer front line along the Marne River, with neither gaining a clear advantage. How brutal was this battle? On the first day alone, the French lost 75,000 troops and the Germans lost 60,000. The ammunition expended by both sides in one day exceeded the total for the entire 1870 war. This bloody slaughter continued for a full 3 days and nights. In the end, there were no brilliant commands or magical tactics. Both sides were simply competing to see who could sacrifice more lives. In order to send reinforcements to the front lines in a timely manner, Gallieni organized 600 taxis in Paris. This was likely the world's first motorized column, which saved the precarious situation of the battle. Of course, while saving the country, the drivers of Paris still had to charge for their services. On the other side of the battlefield, Moltke's General Staff telegraph machine was as if it had malfunctioned. It couldn't receive any messages at all. In the end, he had to resort to the old method of sending a messenger to inspect the front lines. This messenger's name was Richard Hench, just a lieutenant colonel under Moltke, but he was given unlimited authority and could even mobilize troops in the name of the General Staff. When Hench arrived at the Second Army, he ordered the troops to stop their attack and immediately withdraw, citing Moltke's authorization. In this way, the Schlieffen Plan, which had been the German army's great hope, was halted by a mere lieutenant colonel. Later, Germany lost the war, and this incident became a huge conspiracy theory. Unwilling to accept defeat, many Germans insisted that dark forces had stolen the victory that should have been theirs. But given the situation at the time, Hench's judgment was much more reliable than Moltke's, and if he hadn't detected the gap between the First and Second Armies in time, the consequences for the Germans could have been even more disastrous. Speaking of gaps, the British were still on their way. They officially set out on September 6th and then took 3 full days to cover the distance, progressing at a rate of just 8 miles per day. But by this time, the Germans were already preparing to retreat. And so, the Battle of the Marne ended in a manner of barking but not biting. In this battle, a total of 2 million troops were involved, with 250,000 casualties for the French and 200,000 for the Germans. This battle was the most decisive of the entire World War I, shattering Germany's hopes for a quick victory and dragging them into a bloody war of attrition, ultimately helping the Allies secure the miracle victory of Marne. As for who was the hero of the Allied forces, both Joffre and Gallieni had their respective supporters. But as for who should be held responsible for the German defeat, Moltke could hardly escape blame. On September 14th, just 3 days after the end of the Battle of the Marne, he was officially relieved of his duties by the German Emperor, and the supreme command of the German army was handed over to the famous butcher of Verdun, Falkenhayn. On September 15th, 1914, the German First and Second Armies, pursued by the Allies, retreated to the area around the Eisner River, 25 miles north of the Marne. At this time, the morale of the German troops on the northern front was very low, and the southern front was firmly blocked by the 9th Army, led by Foch. If the Allies could break through the Eisner River in one go, the entire German front line might collapse in a chain reaction. No one would have expected that. In such a critical moment, the savior of the German army would not be a hero or advanced weapons, but a simple, entrenching shovel. Before the war broke out, the German army issued an entrenching shovel to every soldier, while the attack-loving French army did not. This decision had a significant impact on the Western Front in 1914. The German troops who reached the Aisne River area skillfully dug out a trench and then engaged in their favorite defensive battle. Since the main force of the French army had been severely damaged, the the belated British army was pushed to the front line. Then they made the same mistake as the early French army. The British soldiers charged into the dense Maxim fire, with each wave of attack resulting in thousands of casualties. And not a single soldier could reach the German positions. A day later, French ordered the troops to stop, because if they continued, none of them would make it back home. So reluctantly, the British also began to dig trenches against the Germans. And thus, both sides unintentionally opened the most terrifying aspect of the war, the trench warfare. This trench, starting from the Marne River, extended south to the Swiss border and north to the Strait of Dover. For the next 4 years, regardless of how many lives were poured into it, this front line would undergo little change. The trench system of World War I typically consisted of 3 lines of defense. The first was the fire line, usually manned by a small number of combat units. Once the enemy launched a large-scale artillery barrage, the troops would move to the second line of support, about 70 yards behind. Behind the support line, about 300 yards away, was the final line of defense, the reserve line. If the first 2 lines were unfortunately lost, the troops would depart from here to retake the trenches. Between the 3 lines of defense were several narrow communication trenches, where soldiers spent most of their time living in these dark and damp ditches. The first challenge they faced was disease. Crowded and filthy living conditions, contaminated water from decomposing bodies, and swarms of rats and fleas made for ideal breeding grounds for bacteria. Throughout the entire First World War, about 1/3 of casualties occurred in the rear. Since penicillin had not yet been invented, even minor wounds could lead to gangrene. The doctors' only recourse was amputation. Another major killer in trench warfare was the sniper. German soldiers were equipped with the formidable G98 rifle, while the British adopted the famous Lee Enfield the following year, with a few elite troops equipped with optical sights. Initially, some foolhardy soldiers dared to venture out of the trenches, but after experiencing the power of snipers, no one dared to do so again. If you were lucky enough to visit a trench from the outside, you wouldn't see a single enemy soldier because anyone exposed in sight would last no more than 5 seconds. This led to a vast no-man's land between the 2 trenches, impossible to cross. Only the patrols of both sides dared to venture into it at night, risking their lives to scout. If 2 patrols happened to encounter each other in no man's land, they could only settle their differences with cold steel, as any slight noise would attract artillery fire and machine guns. Of course, some wanted to break this stalemate, and Foch was one of them. After taking over from the ineffectual Joffre, he decided to reinforce the Western Front. Then he meticulously selected a graveyard for the German army, Ypres, a small town in northern Belgium. This place happened to form a salient on the Allied defensive line, guarded by the British Expeditionary Force. After their defeat on the River Ain, they requested a transfer closer to the sea, ending up in Ypres. Unexpectedly, it became the primary target of the German offensive. On October 20th, 1914, 4 newly formed reserve corps of the German Fourth Army launched an attack on Ypres. These new recruits had no combat experience. Some were even students who knew nothing of the brutality of war. Thus, the most brutal scene on the Western Front unfolded. Countless German soldiers braved the no-man's land, only to be mowed down by artillery fire in rows. If they managed to reach the enemy trenches, they would be helpless before the barbed wire, becoming sitting ducks for machine gun fire. Nevertheless, these German recruits managed to briefly breach the British lines through enormous sacrifice. But lacking the capability to hold the trenches, they could only watch helplessly as the British retook their positions. The battle raged on intermittently until November, with German casualties reaching 130,000. To boost morale, the German Emperor Wilhelm II personally visited the front lines, awarding the Iron Cross to a student battalion from Marburg University. This battalion suffered heavy casualties in subsequent assaults, with 70% perishing in battle. To this day, there is a student cemetery near Ypres commemorating them. Behind the densely packed names on the memorial stones lay the lives of 25,000 young men who might have had bright futures and promising careers. But in that cold winter, they all became undignified corpses, lying quietly on foreign soil, waiting even for someone to bury them. On November 15th, a heavy snowfall halted the madness of slaughter. People gazed at the snowflakes falling from the sky and the muddy ground, realizing how quickly time had passed with Christmas approaching. As early as 3 weeks before Christmas, Pope Benedict XV had issued a formal ceasefire proposal, asking warring nations to at least silence their guns on the night when angels sing. The Pope's proposal was summarily rejected by military authorities of all countries, considering their countless crimes committed. Letting angels sing was the least of their concerns. However, on December 24th, a Bavarian soldier named Karl Miller cut down a small fir tree on a hill, dragging it for 9 miles to the frontline trenches. This fir tree seemed to possess a magical power, instantly illuminating the lifeless trenches. German soldiers lit candles around it and sang Christmas carols. The singing reached the British trenches, where a few bold soldiers cautiously peered out, only to be greeted not by sniper bullets, but by a cheerful, "Merry Christmas, John." After waiting for a while, the British responded, "Merry Christmas, Fritz. How about a smoke?" The Germans continued, "No, I'll get shot." After a long silence, a proposal came from the German side. "Let's each walk halfway and meet in the middle." And so, a German soldier and a British soldier cautiously climbed out of their trenches, slowly walking towards the center of no man's land. When they successfully met, both sides' trenches erupted into deafening cheers, as if they had just won a glorious victory. Over the next few days, soldiers from both sides emerged from their trenches, chatting like old friends, exchanging Christmas gifts. German buttons were particularly popular, while the British reciprocated with cigarettes and jam. And of course, there was football, the sport beloved by the working class. In the end, the German team narrowly defeated the British team 3-2 in this friendly match. Amid the celebrations, people did not forget the dead. They collected the bodies of fallen comrades and held a simple and solemn funeral. During the mourning process, officers from both sides naturally engaged in conversation. "Why did you come to Belgium?" asked the German officer. "This war has nothing to do with you. We are fighting for freedom," proudly replied the British officer. No, shook his head the German officer. "We are the ones fighting for freedom." Perhaps the confusion of these two officers would never be resolved, as soon the high commands of both sides halted these shameful ceasefire acts, decreeing that anyone fraternizing with the enemy would face military justice. On December 31st, the last day of 1914, two officers solemnly shook hands in the center of no man's land. Then they raised their pistols and fired 3 shots into the air, signaling that the war would continue. Undoubtedly, the Christmas truce was the most memorable moment of the entire First World War, fully demonstrating the absurdity of the war and the splendor of human nature. But it should be pointed out that these truces occurred only on a very small scale. On the lines held by the French and Belgian armies, the only Christmas gifts given to invaders were bullets. Even if we focus only on the battlefield of Ypres, we will sadly discover that those soldiers who embraced each other on Christmas night would be attacking each other with chlorine gas 4 months later, relentlessly, as this was the true face of war. Rationality could not restrain it, nor could human nature influence it. It followed only the most primitive, savage, and cruel laws of nature. Before the last soldier bled out, no one could stop it. All right, that wraps up our content for this episode. In the next episode, we'll be heading to the Eastern Front. There, on the vast plains of Eastern Europe, trench warfare isn't the norm, so the war takes on a whole new dimension. On the other hand, we'll also witness the various issues within the Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies, as well as the tragic story of the Serbians defending their homeland. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.